And welcome back to the OperaWire Podcast. I'm your co-host David Salazar. I'm here with my brother Francisco, and we have a good episode.
We do. We have had quite a few weeks of no episodes, but we're back and we're back stronger than ever and have a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
I think yes. I think right now we're gonna start with the Metropolitan Opera. A lot of things have been happening at the Met, but let's start in the positive because last night, May 4th, the day of the Met Gala, I went to the Met Opera Gala. So I was not at the Vet Museum Gala where all the Anna Wintour and all the celebrities were. I was at the Metropolitan Opera Gala where a lot of opera celebrities were and where I got to hang with some of the best singers in the world and also got to hear from Met General Manager and got to have a wonderful dinner and thanks to Perrier Joe, who invited us. So that was wonderful and really fun experience. There were performances from Asmi Grigorian, Aileen Perez, Hermonella Jajo, Rosa Feola, Liparitz Agvetsian, Stanislav de Barbarac, and Angel Blue, who concluded the evening with some spirituals and some jazz standards. So it was a lot of fun. We danced. It was the first time I was ever on the Met stage because the dinner's on the Met stage. So this was like everything uh, that I could have dreamed of. They were honoring Daisy Soros, who has been a philanthropist, and she was the one who helped spearhead the Tudor trilogy when Sandro Aronofsky did it in 2015-16, who helped bring the production of Un ballo in maschera to the Met. Medea also was one of her other productions, and she last season was able to help bring Salome, which starred Elsa von den Hever, to the Met. So this was a wonderful celebration of the Met, a wonderful evening of music and dance, and lots to drink, and just very good food. And
how is the
just
Perrier Jouet champagne?
it's very bubbly and it's very light, very rosé-esque champagne. I would say it can get you drunk if you have a little bit too much because it's very tasty and it's very good. It's very different from a Clicquot. It's very different from those types, which are a little bit more, I don't want to say acidic, but they're not as bright or as fruity. I guess it's a preference, but Perrier Joye was announced as the official
Champagne
champagne
of the
of the
Metropolitan
Metropolitan
Opera.
Opera. Yep. So this was kind of the first go around for them, and they were the ones who were serving the booze last night. So it was a party.
Yeah, and I don't think we can overstate because that is a historic situation. It's one of many news items that the Met has had over the last several months since we've had a more formal news structured podcast episode. And I was very curious to see that they kind of pull out the red carpet, so to speak, for this kind of event. You were there, it was black tie. From what you told me, from the pictures that you sent, it seemed like it was quite the experience. Um, yeah, I'm just assuming, and based on your description, the general tenor of the evening was very, very relaxed and fun and chill and exciting. For a company that has had a lot of ups and downs over the last couple of weeks. I think it really, for me, what stood out when they announced this collaboration was great. This is really good for the company because they obviously need to make some deals, get some partnerships, build it up because everyone knows at this point that the Metropolitan Opera's financial crisis is just untenable. What I found, and in conjunction with performances from Sting and Andrea Bocelli and, um, you know, more popular artists coming in and renting out the hall and, putting on out performances, what's become apparent is that there's obviously a shift in strategy to try and find new sources of revenue for the Met. What I find saddening about the whole situation, and obviously I don't want to jump from something so positive to so negative, but the reality is that the conversation around the Met is not at its height right now. And so unfortunately, because they also announced their season, which I think has a lot of really interesting things for next year, but again, 16 operas. It's not it's
17.
all folded in. Sorry?
17.
17, excuse me. It's all folded up in questionable situations. Now, the reason why I bring this up is I wonder if the Met had been more proactive about these things years ago. Because right now I feel like every conversation they're gonna come into with negotiations is not from a point of power, from a point of weakness, because everyone that they're negotiating with knows they need money. And so they're gonna set the terms, not Peter Gelb, not the Met board. The other person's gonna set the board. And that's a bad look because maybe if the Met had been a little bit more out of the box thinking when they weren't in desperation mode, maybe the situation's not even the case because they
Right.
were more proactive about it.
Right. With the whole Perrier Joye was is actually very interesting because I was one of their guests and we were at table 10. So I was invited alongside influencers. Um, so none of the people at our table knew much about opera. I was seated next to someone who had worked with Architectural Digest. We had another one who was a sommelier, and his husband was someone who worked in social media. The other four people were also social media influencers, and they really didn't have much idea of opera. And after Hermonella Jajo performed Adio del Passato, I turned around to one of my the people was person who was sitting next to me, and I asked her, Does this really like disengage you to want to go to the opera?" And she said, "Actually, I found it really moving, and I almost was in tears." And what that brings me to is I think maybe having this company right now who is about, champagne. When you think of champagne, you think of high class, you think of comfort, you think of luxury and elegance. And it's really actually maybe perhaps having and giving a table to Perrier Joye and other people and bringing in people who've never experienced opera and who get to hear some of the world class opera singers in the world perform. Maybe that engages that public that they maybe didn't have because they're thinking outs because not necessarily is the Met thinking outside the box, but the people that they're bringing in are thinking outside the box and trying to bring in new audiences and new people. So I found that to be very fascinating and interesting, and I wanted to put it in the positive aspect
Of
because I
course.
think, in my opinion, last night was a very positive experience and was a very fun experience to go to the Met Opera. I do think that there is definitely the energy is positive, and I think with artists there, it really lightens and heightens things. But I do think within the industry and within the people, board members, and anything like that, and I'm not saying I know what they're saying. I do think that there is definitely a pressure to try to make and get back this house from all the negative uh headlines, from the Saudi deal that we talked about a few months ago, uh, going the
Which is no
ways.
longer a thing, right?
Yeah, it goes the wayside. And so I think where the company can bring in these positivities is this new thing with Perrier Joya, which I think is a very positive thing, or bringing in Sting into the opera, which we talked about a few months ago, and also bringing in people that love the art form and might not necessarily work in the art form. I always, we talk about how do you promote opera? Al Roker was at the gala. He's one of the board members. Clearly loves opera. He's a news guy. There's a lot of people in the opera world that don't either sing or perform or direct, that love opera, that go to an opera, that are happy to go. They should be ambassadors to the opera, and this is something that their board and the Met should be thinking about. What kind of ambassadors can they bring in to do? Because, like, for example, the Met Gala on the other side, the museum, they're bringing a bunch of pop stars, and I'm not saying that they're the biggest, that they're ignorant and that they don't love art. They do love museum. They go to the museums. They do love art, but do they necessarily like? Are they the tastemakers? Maybe they are the tastemakers. Are they the most sophisticated and most elegant? No, but they're ambassadors for fashion, for art, for music, and they're bringing people and eyes, and they're bringing money in. So the Met needs to think that way. I think in more of a popular culture and find the right ambassadors that will represent their house and not necessarily think that a Saudi deal is going to save save them, or not necessarily think that by selling the Chagalls, which are apparently, as reported, up for sale, which they're not going to leave the building because part of the sale is that they actually have to stay in the building. But those things are the types of things that they should start thinking about. And I think with Perrier Joye bringing in these younger people, or these people that don't necessarily know opera, well, they're gonna post on their pictures, and their people are gonna ask, "Where were you?" And they're gonna say, "We were at the Met Opera Gala, and we got to dance and mingle with the stars and eat on the stage." That's something that's already a different exposure that they probably wouldn't have gotten had they not had this branding opportunity.
Did anyone make reference to the other Met Gala happening last night?
I mean, for sure, it was definitely a conversation. But I mean, after a while, we're there, and I mean, you and me, we know a lot of these singers. We've interviewed a lot of these singers, and friends with some of them. So, after a while, I kind of left my table and I went and mingled with some of the singers and talked and had some selfies. And at the end of the night, we had to dance. I was excited to just go on the dance floor and be able to to just enjoy the party. And who knew I was gonna end up dancing in the same place where Angel Blue and Asmi Gregorian and Eileen Perez were dancing. So that was fun. So I got to experience that, and so it is fun. The artists are there, and they were in great spirits. And again, having them perform for these people that don't necessarily know opera is already a positive for the company, because now they got to see them up close and personal. They got to mingle with them, and they got to experience an art form that they perhaps wouldn't have had they not been invited to this gala.
So you mentioned the Saudi deal, and we talked about it at length before. And a few weeks ago, it was weeks ago, maybe I don't remember exactly. It was announced that the deal had fallen through. According to General Manager Peter Gill, it was because of the war in the Middle East, Iran war, and obviously, there's a lot of concern about how money is being used. Obviously, the Saudi Arabian government is probably, taking care of how they manage things because everything is so unpredictable right now. Um, I think the big question with this situation is, all right, the cat's out of the bag. You're looking for these kinds of collaborations. Is there a company that has, I mean, probably not the deep pockets that Saudi Arabia has, and the willingness to invest in Western culture to obviously prop up their image worldwide as well? Where does the Met go from here with a situation like this? Because obviously, yeah, it was not even 10% of their yearly budget, because I think it was $200 million over the course of 8 years.
Yeah.
The Mets, as we know, the Mets operating budget yearly is close to 400 million. So it was like, it was a small percentage, but at least optically it was, well, you can debate whether it was positive depending on how you view Saudi Arabia, right? But where does the Met go from here? What other partnerships do you look for when that one just kind of blew up in your face like that?
I don't, it's a question that I think a lot of people are asking, and I mean, I don't necessarily have the right answer. I don't work in that administration. Obviously, I'm here with you, and we talk about it all the time. I you know, and I think it's really clear that I think leadership at this point needs to change. I think there needs to be some freshening. I think leadership also just needs to be out of the press. I don't want to hear from leadership talking about how bad the situation is, because for example, when they added a performance of Tristan and Isolde, there was a headline from the New York Times, which we actually talked about, how the Met was in this financial crisis, and leadership talked about a deal with Elon Musk. I'm sorry, but those are the types of things where you say, no, we're actually doing very well this season in terms of ticket sales. We added a performance of Tristan and Isolde. We had performances of Cavalier and Clay. You change. I think with PR firms, and I think with a lot of people, you see with pop stars, how they change the complete narrative, and they switch things around when there's a negative. They move and forward with a different PR strategy. I think right now the PR strategy should be talking about all the positives that are happening, about all the great artists and leadership. this summer, when they're touting their next season, should not be talking about a lawsuit or a specific soprano. They should be talking about the upcoming 17 productions that they are performing. I honestly, I've last season, before this season started, this summer. Okay, you have the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra, which is an important cause, and I think it's a really incredible tour that they're having this summer with some very important stars. They're allowed to talk about that. But after that, you have to you don't answer the questions that journalists want to hear about lawsuits and about financial crisis. No. You turn that around and you talk about, we're opening the season with the role debut of Lisa Davidson in Macbeth, and after her stellar performance in Tristan and Isolde, this is happening. You turn around the narrative and you say, we have a new production of Fanciulla del West with superstar Sandra Darbanovsky. She's a legend now. You turn around the narrative and you talk about how Asmik Grigorian is one of the greatest singers of our time and one of the great singing actresses, and she's coming to do her acclaimed version of Yenufa. And you talk about how we are in an artistic a moment.
Yeah, but hold on a second. Like that one could interpret that as gaslighting. Do you
You
really
know what? You know what? Let me tell
are you really advocating for that right now?
honestly, yes. You need to I'm sorry. I believe in the power of changing the narrative. You can't talk to journalists who, by the way, if you look at the headlines, are all negative. You have to have some type of positive to this. It's ridiculous. I mean, why would you want to have more negativity and add to the fuel to the fire? It's ridiculous. I personally believe in that. Yes, you need to confront the reality, right? But hearing people talk about how the Met is going to die, because let me tell you something, there are a lot of people out there who will say it's a sinking ship, right? You need to
It's
change
the
that narrative.
Titanic, right? The Titanic.
Right, it's Titanic. You need to change that narrative, and you need to talk about that we're in our artistic renaissance, or whatever the hell you wanna talk about it. And you also need to get rid of talking about people that are no longer singing there. The negative press that you got in from lawsuits, from talking about specific artists that are no longer performing there, and creating more, not hate, but dislike for a company, is not going to help you sell tickets. I want to hear about the artists that are there. They need to start promoting their seasons. And I'll repeat it. Last summer, it was all about a specific singer, and it was not about the new season. What is that? What kind of marketing is that? And what kind of leadership is that? And
I
what does it say? What does it say about the artists that they currently have, that they're not important enough to be talking about them?
I will say that, on one hand, because there's a couple of things I wanna hit, and I wanna push back on. First of all, I do think you're right in that, there's 2 things that happen when we look at an article, from the New York Times, for example, because that's the only person that management seems to talk to, directly. There's always there always just seem to be this, like, I'm trying to find the right word for it, but, like, the boilerplate is the art life in the United States, the arts in the United States are under fire, and this is just happening everywhere, and it's tough. I'm not saying that's not true, because we both know that, the NEA is under fire, and, when you don't have a situation in Europe where you do have public funds, which doesn't necessarily solve anything if you look at UK, um, but, there is a certain kind of, like, security there that, a company like the Metropolitan Opera, which deals with unions, has a mega budget of 400 million, a year. Um, you know, there are situations where, yeah, I understand that the arts are under fire and things are challenging, but I also think that when you start repeating the same message over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, it starts sounding like an excuse, right? Because what are you doing about it? That's why I come back to this Perrier Jouet, and the Sting concerts and all those things. Why wasn't this happening 10 years ago? I know that the pandemic changed everything for a lot of companies. I know for the Met specifically, the pandemic was brutal, but and no one could have predicted the pandemic. So I'm not gonna like put that on them. But
No.
also, I don't think it just happened at the pandemic. I think it was happening gradually, maybe more drastically after the pandemic. Now that the pandemic is a good excuse for things that just kind of spiraling, and maybe things are more evident after the pandemic. But you also got to start. That's my problem. I feel like the management has been reactive rather than proactive, And I think that's just that maybe at the beginning of his tenure, 20 years ago, by the way, which HDs, there was a certain level of like, okay, there's change happening. And I think over the years, that has just kind of lapsed into we got to react. There's a level. That's why I think renovation of leadership is so important, especially at the highest levels, because a comfort does start to set in. There is kind of this sense of like, okay, the job is kind of happening. Certain factors become predictable. You get comfortable, and then you get set in your ways, and you need a constant flux because someone's got to come in and shake things up. It has a different vision, has a different perception of the world around them. They got to come in and they got to renovate. And I think that the strategy of just blaming it on the outside world really doesn't help how you're managing it. And I don't think reactivity does it well for anyone. To push back on one thing though, you're talking about journalism and headlines and gaslighting. How much do we contribute to the negativity? Us personally, because on some level, like you have to look at the situation and say, well, yeah, we're reporting on those negative things. We're putting out opinions on those things. I mean, here on our podcast, we're doing that. So how does that affect? It's part of the reality. We can't just like censor ourselves and say we're not going to talk about the negative things. I think, for example, I go back to that Tristan and Isolde headline. I found it very confounding that the day before a really positive performance that was got an extra performance added, it was selling really well. It was so sold out they couldn't even give tickets to members of the press. And the New York Times kind of threw that article out there that kind of embarrassed Peter Gale, to be honest with you. The reason why I took issue with that was because that's the only organization that Peter Gale will have a conversation with, and you know, they're they're basically making him look awful the day before a big success. And I'm not gonna put it on the New York Times because the New York Times is gonna do what the New York Times is gonna do. But I'm gonna ask Peter Gelb, like, you should part of the strategy should be you should be speaking to, and I don't care. I don't think he doesn't have to speak to us, but he should be speaking to other outlets, because I understand about controlling the narrative, but they're not doing very good control of
But what's
narratives.
the narrative? And I'm sorry to say it, but the things that we write is only what's in the New York Times and what's in the press. We've never interviewed leadership because leadership has never been interested in talking to us. And to be very frank with you, you know, I personally don't think I'm contributing half of the negative buzz because the New York Times didn't write about the new performances of Tristan and Isolde. They didn't. They wrote an article about something else. The New York Times didn't write about, well, they did, but they really didn't, about Cavalier and Clay. We did. So we're kind of, at the end of the day, contributing both what's what's printed and at the same time contributing to what the information that we have. So, at the end of the day, we're also here to report the news. Now, if management decided that they were going to do an interview or about what's going on or what the future is or what future plans are, like for example how they're going to evolve HD or how they're going to do a spread about the upcoming productions that a certain artist is going to do, we'll report on that. Why? Because it's important and because excites people. Because at the end of the day, you also have to excite the people that are going to the opera. And if they don't feel excited about what's going on, then what are we? And if they don't give us anything to excite people, we're not reporting those exciting things. The end of the day, there's this idea of, oh, we have to hide everything under. No, I think we have to move away from that and say, okay, in 2 seasons, I don't know, Lisa Davidson is doing Brunhilde, which we know already. But who else? What other artists? What other artists are in this house besides Lisa Davidson that are actually cared about and that we're actually moving forward? That's another thing. Leadership has done a bad job with artists. They no longer are bringing up artists. They're no longer giving these pathways and careers where they're seeing them grow as artists. They just plop them here, plop them there, see what sticks and see what doesn't. And I've always said it. Audiences want to get to know artists. And if they don't know these artists, if they don't appear if they appear every other year, or if they don't appear, they appear once and then 10 years later, well, they're not going to get to know these artists. They're not going to get to know who they are. And that's the difference, I think, in Europe, where there's a lot of companies where these artists appear every year, and where art people get excited to see these artists, and where these artists, who may not be the biggest superstars in the world, become legends for these houses. And because they've seen them grow, because they've seen them grow as artists, and change, and change from the repertoire that they were doing as youths to what they're doing now as older and more mature artists. And I think leadership has not done a good job in promoting their artists, in giving their artists something where their audiences feel like they can experience them every year, or if not experience them every year, where they get to know these artists. That doesn't happen anymore.
All right, shifting the conversation back to positive light. What's one production you're really excited about at the Met next year?
Next season, I am very excited to. I have to say, Fanchula del West is one production that I'm very excited to see. Sandra Radonowski is one of the legendary sopranos that is performing now, and she's in a later part of her career. And uh, she's an artist that I think has been taken for granted at the Metropolitan Opera, who was at one point performing every season and now performs very rarely there. So I'm very excited that she's returning, and she's getting a new production. She's getting an HD, and this is a new role for her. And it's an evolution from, the Puccini roles that we've seen her do Tosca, and she did Turandot at the Royal Opera House, and she's been doing these very more dramatic roles over the years. So I'm very excited to be able to experience her artistry again.
Yeah, that's my favorite Puccini opera, so I'm really excited about that. But I'm excited for Otello. It's my favorite opera. Hasn't been back in a long time. You got two really exciting casts. You have Michael Fabiano, Angel Blue in one cast, and Fabiano had a great success in Spain recently performing a role. And then later on in the season with the HT, we got Brian Jade, who also recently, we spoke to, and he told us about how much he loved the role. And obviously Eileen Perez, who I'll sing. We recently saw her do Madame Butterfly, and I don't. That was special. That was a special experience. I'll see her in anything, to be honest with you, because she just always brings a special kind of artistry to everything that she does. It's quite special. So I'm really excited to see my favorite opera back on the Met stage in a production that I'm not very fond of, but it doesn't matter. I'll go for the music.
And I'll say, I think next season is very exciting because on paper, there's amazing casts, amazing singers, and I do hope that this season the Met does promote some of their up and coming debutantes, like, for example, Saya Hernandez, who is one of the most exciting Spanish sopranos in the world, and who has already performed in every major opera house. So I hope to see that the Met takes advantage of this exciting debut and other debuts, because there's a lot, and they give them the promotion, and they give them their moment, because I think when you're bringing artists and you're introducing artists to the Met stage, they deserve a proper introduction, and I do hope for that for this next season.
So shifting gears for the second story I wanted to cover, as if we didn't bring a lot of heat already. So the Teatro La Fenice finally made a decision. Um, Not without controversy, not without pushback. What the hell happened there?
So we've been talking about Beatrice Venezzi for a few months now. She was named the music director of the Teatro La Fenice. Back, I want to say last year, and uh,
She never performed with you. With
she never performed with the company, and she created this extremely controversial movement with the orchestra
I
protest.
don't think it. I don't think it's fair to say she created it.
No. Management
Her hiring created it.
were created, and there were so many protests. There was exits from the from some of the board members, because they did not agree with the decision, because they thought that the decision was not transparent, and they thought it was done very much due to government, and due to her closeness to the government of Meloni. And so she was in Buenos Aires. She was performing, conducting there. She has a very strong relationship with the Teatro Colón. So Beatrice Venezzi, let's also give her fair share. She does have experience. She just doesn't have as much experience conducting in Italy. And I think in Italy there is this sort of reverence for these posts, as they should be. especially La Fenice, which is one of the greatest opera houses in Italy. And so she never conducted there. She was named music director, and she went when she was in Buenos Aires. She gave this very interesting interview where she said that the people who get named in the Fenice are generally the sons or the brothers or the this are connected in some way, shape, or form to uh, the companies, and basically she inferred that there was so much nepotism, and that did not go very well with management. Uh, so and so, given that the next day or 2 days after the interview was published, well, Nicola Colabanchi basically said, "We're canceling all of your contracts um, for the future because that was very offensive language." And it was the last performance of Lohengrin, and basically the audience and the orchestra had a standing ovation when it was announced that she had been fired.
And it's kind of crazy though, but this is a situation that was created by management. Because whatever you want to say about Beatrice Venezzi, she's look, whether or not it was because of her closeness to Meloni, if Meloni was the one that pushed for this, whatever. Was she gonna say no? Why would she say no? She's being offered who's offering her the opportunity? Who's offering her the appointment? Who's pushing through this appointment? She's not gonna say no. That's on management. And then again, go back to, we talk a lot about the Mets management, but companies in Europe, there's so much, especially in Italy, there's a lot of scandal. There's a lot of questionable embezzlement situations. Napoli was recently, this Teatro San Carlo was recently being investigated as well for, I think, something to do with its financial records.
Yep.
There's a lot of corruption in management in Italy, especially, we've seen. I'm not sure it's everywhere, but and from talking to people in the industry, we hear all kinds of stories, idiosyncrasies about managers, people that you think are qualified for positions, and then you realize that maybe they're not, because people reveal things. The point is, there's a lot of questionable decisions being made at the highest level of this industry, which is part of the problem. Not all of it, again, when I hear Peter Gale talk about the outside world being a problem, well, I also say, well, a lot of the problem is self-inflicted. There's a lot of bad leadership. And, the Fenice's leadership right now can wipe their hands clean and say, we got rid of this problem and we get a standing ovation and the orchestra's happy. But they were part of the problem, and whoever's in charge of whoever's in charge, should really take a long look at this situation because it did not go over well. In my opinion, I think it's an embarrassment to the institution that this situation was prolonged for as long as it was.
Yeah.
Of course, you were waiting for her to make a statement or an interview to have a reason to fire her. There's something fishy about that too, because if you didn't really want her from the beginning, why did you bring her in? And if you didn't, and if she was imposed on you, why didn't you fight back? Why did you let this protract itself to the point where she was going to Argentina and having an interview where she was basically speaking out against the company? Because it got to that point because you allowed it to. So I think this situation is embarrassing on all fronts for the company. I don't think I mean, maybe the orchestra's happy and I'm happy for them, and maybe the audience is happy and some of them probably don't even know why. They're probably just, again, I don't want to get political, but this is clearly for some people just a very political situation, right? Because of Venezzi's links to the government, specifically Meloni. Obviously there's a political angle here that I'm not gonna push into, but management owns this too.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that, the opera world is not perfect and that there are crises everywhere. And when the only thing that we can say is, "Oh, it's the fault of our current president," or "It's the fault of the economy." Well, honestly, there's a lot of issues because you look at the Welsh National Opera, for example, and their new season, and I was shocked to see 4 operas. This is a company that presents so many operas, and this next season they had to lower because of what's going on with the Arts Council. You look at the Teatro San Carlo, where a bunch of singers were also included in documents and investigations, and they're being brought in because management doesn't want to handle certain money or taking money from governments, which is ridiculous. So I do think that, when people are also being hired, going back to, management, they need to take a look and really see, like, are these the right qualified people to take this company? And I think this idea of we're gonna go from Paris Opera to then La Scala to then Salzburg and to then Zurich or this and that, like do the switcheroo and everyone stays in the same place. I think that's where you have to question the industries and have to say, okay, maybe it's time that fresh faces and fresh people who are coming down from the bottom or who come from something or coming in, uh, they take the reins of it because maybe they're coming in with something different and a different perspective. And maybe when they're hiring, I don't know, a conductor or whatever it is, they're not making decisions based on governments, based on recommendations, and they're doing it based on, you know, also talking to the orchestra and talking to singers or whatnot. Honestly, the Venezia situation, it made her look bad. I honestly don't have much of an opinion about her conducting because I don't know her conducting. And I also feel bad for her because she got stuck in a situation that maybe she thought was a great opportunity, but realized it was not so great opportunity immediately when all these protests started happening. All that to say is I wish her the best, and I hope that Teatro La Fenice, when they pick their next music director, pick someone that is going to be with more experience with the company and actually has performed with them, so that there's no more controversy and we can continue to have great art, and the narrative can shift towards great art and not negativity.
All right. So with all that in mind, I think we're gonna call it a day on this episode. As always, thank you very much to all listeners. And we're gonna, we'll have an exciting episode coming up with a special guest.
Yes. A very special guest with from a program that I actually got to go to 2 years ago. So we're very excited for that episode. And please subscribe to YouTube, to Spotify, to Apple, wherever you get your podcast, subscribe to this podcast. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we'll see you at the opera.